The phone screen lit up at 2 in the morning, and Amara stared at it without touching it. Daniel's name sat there, glowing, waiting. She knew what it meant. It always meant the same thing. He was upset about something, or lonely about something, or both, and she was the only name he trusted enough to call at that hour. She let it ring twice before she answered. "Hey," she said, her voice rough with sleep but steady, like she had trained it to sound that way no matter what time it was. "Did I wake you?" Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer. "No," she lied. He laughed softly, the kind of laugh that meant he didn't believe her but appreciated the lie anyway. Then he told her about his day, about the argument with his manager, about the woman he had been seeing for a few weeks who had stopped replying to his messages, about how tired he was of people who didn't understand him the way she did. Amara listened. She always listened. It was the thing she did best, the thing that made her feel needed, even if needed was not the same as wanted. They had met 3 years earlier, at a friend's birthday dinner in a small restaurant with mismatched chairs and candles that dripped wax onto paper tablecloths. Amara remembered every detail of that night because her mind had decided, without asking her permission, that this was a night worth remembering. Daniel had been seated across from her, telling a story about a road trip that had gone wrong in the best possible way, and everyone at the table had been laughing, but Amara had been watching his hands as he spoke, the way he used them to paint pictures in the air. There was something about him that felt like sunlight through a window on a cold morning. Warm, but not something you could hold on to. She did not fall in love with him that night. That would come later, slowly, the way frost creeps across a window pane until one morning you look up and the whole glass is covered, and you cannot remember when it started. What she felt that first night was curiosity, a small voice inside her that said, "I want to know more about this person," and so she did. She added him on social media. She liked his photos, not too quickly, not too often, careful the way people are careful when they don't want to reveal too much of themselves. She learned that he worked in marketing for a small company downtown. She learned that he loved old films and terrible puns and dogs more than most people loved other humans. They became friends the ordinary way two people become friends in a city full of strangers. Group outings turned into occasional coffee meetings. Coffee meetings turned into him texting her when something funny happened during his day, because he knew she would understand the joke the way no one else would. Text messages turned into phone calls. Phone calls turned into him calling her his best friend, a title she wore with a smile on her face and something heavier sitting behind her ribs. Sophie, her closest friend since college, was the first person to say the words out loud. "You're in love with him," Sophie said one evening, sitting cross-legged on Amara's couch with a bowl of popcorn between them, the television forgotten in the background. "I'm not," Amara said automatically. Sophie raised an eyebrow, the kind of look that came from years of knowing someone well enough to see through their excuses. "Amara, you checked your phone 4 times in the last 10 minutes. I'm allowed to check my phone." "You are, but you only do that when it might be him." Amara did not answer right away. She looked down at the phone in her lap, the screen dark and quiet, and something in her chest tightened, the way it always did when someone said out loud what she had been trying not to think about. "Even if I am," she finally said, "it doesn't matter, he doesn't see me that way." "Have you ever told him how you feel?" "No." "Why not?" Amara had asked herself that question more times than she could count, lying awake at night, replaying conversations, searching for the moment when things might have shifted if she had only said something different. The truth was complicated, tangled up in fear and hope and the strange comfort of loving someone from a safe distance. "Because if I tell him," she said slowly, "and he says no, then I lose him completely. Right now I still get to have this. I get to be the person he calls. I get to be close to him. If I say something and it goes wrong, I lose all of it." Sophie's expression softened, but there was worry behind her eyes. "And what happens if you never say anything? What do you lose then?" Amara did not have an answer for that. Or maybe she did, and she simply did not want to say it out loud, because saying it would make it real, and as long as it stayed unspoken, she could keep pretending that time was still on her side. The next weeks passed in the pattern that had become familiar. Daniel would text her good morning, a habit that meant nothing to him and everything to her. He would tell her about his weekend plans, sometimes inviting her along, sometimes not, depending on who else would be there. When his romantic relationships ended, which happened often, because Daniel seemed to fall in and out of interest with the same ease that other people changed their shoes, he would come to Amara first before he told anyone else, and she would sit with him while he processed his disappointment, offering comfort, offering her time, offering herself in every way except the one that mattered. She told herself this was fine. She told herself that closeness was its own kind of gift, that maybe if she stayed patient enough, kind enough, present enough, something inside him would eventually shift, and he would look at her one day and see what had been standing in front of him the entire time. It was a comforting story to tell herself. Comforting stories are often the ones we repeat the most because the alternative feels too heavy to hold. There was a night in early spring when Amara thought, for one brief and shining moment, that everything might change. They had gone to a rooftop gathering hosted by a mutual friend, the kind of evening with string lights and quiet music, and the city stretched out below like a field of stars fallen to earth. Daniel had spent most of the night by her side, refilling her drink before she finished it, listening to her talk about a project at work with more attention than he usually gave anyone. At one point, when the wind picked up and she shivered, he took off his jacket without being asked and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You looked cold," he said simply, as though it were nothing. To Amara, it was everything. Later that night, when the party had thinned and most of their friends had gone home, they sat together on the edge of the rooftop, legs dangling over empty space, the city humming quietly beneath them. "Can I tell you something?" Daniel asked, his voice quieter than usual. Amara's heart moved into her throat. "Of course." He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the skyline instead of at her. "Sometimes I think you're the only person in my life who actually gets me, like really gets me, not just the version of me I show everyone else." "I do get you," she said softly. He turned to look at her then, and for a moment, just a moment, something passed between them that felt different from every other moment they had shared. His eyes held hers a little longer than necessary. The silence between them stretched, full and fragile, like the pause before a held breath is finally released. Amara's whole body felt still, waiting. Then Daniel looked away, laughed a little, and said, "Sorry, I don't know why I'm being so serious. Must be the wine." The moment closed as quickly as it had opened, and Amara sat there with her heart still racing, wondering if she had imagined the whole thing, or if she had simply witnessed a door open and shut before she could step through it. She wrapped his jacket tighter around her shoulders and said nothing, because saying something felt too dangerous, and staying silent felt like the only way to keep the night from breaking apart completely. Walking home alone later, since Daniel had offered to share a ride but she had told him she wanted the fresh air, Amara replayed the moment over and over in her mind. She turned it over like a stone in her palm, checking every angle, searching for proof that it had meant something. By the time she reached her apartment, she had convinced herself that it did. That something had shifted. That patience, after all this time, might finally be paying off. She did not know yet that this feeling, this hopeful ache in her chest, was one she would carry for a long time still, through many more nights like this one, through many more moments that almost became something and then quietly did not. She only knew that for the first time in longer than she could remember, hope felt like it might not be foolish after all. She fell asleep that night with her phone on her chest, waiting for a message that would not come until morning, and even then it would only say good morning, same as always, with no mention of the rooftop, no mention of the silence, no mention of anything at all. Spring turned into summer, and the city changed the way it always did, the streets growing louder, the evenings stretching longer, people spilling out of cafes and parks with the kind of energy that only warm weather could bring. Amara's life moved forward on two separate tracks that summer. On one track was her actual life, her job at the design studio, her growing friendship with a new coworker named Grace, her mother's phone calls asking when she would finally settle down. On the other track, running quietly underneath everything else, was Daniel. He had started seeing someone new by early June, a woman named Olivia who worked in finance and laughed loudly at parties and seemed, from what Amara could tell, entirely wrong for him. Amara met her twice, both times at group gatherings, and both times she smiled and made polite conversation, and felt something cold settle in her stomach that she refused to name. "She's nice," Amara told Sophie afterward because it was true, and because she did not know what else to say. "You don't have to pretend with me," Sophie said. "I'm not pretending, she really is nice." "That's not what I mean, and you know it." Amara looked away, focusing on the drink in her hand instead of the expression on her friend's face. "What do you want me to say, Sophie? That it hurts? Fine, it hurts. Is that what you wanted to hear?" Sophie's voice softened immediately, the sharpness gone. "I don't want you to hurt. That's the whole point. I want you to stop putting yourself in a place where you feel this way over and over again." "It's not that simple." "I know it's not, but watching you do this to yourself isn't simple either." Amara did not answer. There was nothing to say that would make the situation less complicated than it already was. She loved Daniel. She had loved him for what felt like a long time now, long enough that she could not remember exactly what her life had looked like before the feeling arrived. And love, once it settles into a person, does not leave simply because logic asks it to. The relationship with Olivia lasted 11 weeks. Amara knew this because Daniel counted it out loud to her the night it ended, sitting on the floor of her apartment with his back against the couch, a glass of water in his hand because Amara had gently steered him away from anything stronger. 11 weeks, he said, staring at the ceiling. "That's not even 3 months. What is wrong with me?" "Nothing is wrong with you," Amara said automatically, the way she always did. "Something has to be wrong with me. This keeps happening. I meet someone, things are good for a while, and then it just falls apart. Every single time." Amara sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and thought about all the things she could say. She thought about telling him that maybe the problem was not something wrong with him, but something he had not yet let himself see, sitting right beside him on the floor of her apartment, holding a glass of water she had poured for him. Instead, she said, "You just haven't met the right person yet." The words tasted strange in her mouth, sour and familiar, because she had said some version of them so many times before, always hoping that saying them would somehow reveal the truth to him, that he would look at her and finally understand that the right person had been sitting beside him this entire time. He never did. "You always know what to say," Daniel said, resting his head briefly on her shoulder, a gesture that meant nothing to him and lit up every nerve in her body. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'll never have to find out," she said quietly, and meant it in a way that frightened her a little. That fall, Amara's work began to demand more of her time. The design studio had taken on a large project for a hotel chain, and she found herself staying late most nights, sketching layouts and revising color palettes until her eyes burned from staring at screens. She welcomed the exhaustion. It gave her something to focus on other than Daniel, other than the quiet ache that lived somewhere beneath her ribs whenever she thought about him spending his evenings with someone new, or worse, spending them alone and not calling her at all. Grace, her coworker, became a closer friend during this stretch of long nights and shared takeout containers. Grace was direct in a way that Sophie was gentle, and one evening, while they were both hunched over their laptops long after the rest of the office had gone home, Grace asked the question that no one else had asked so plainly. "Who's the guy?" Amara looked up startled. "What guy?" "The one you text with that specific face. Every time your phone buzzes, you get this look, like you're bracing yourself for something." Amara laughed, though it came out thin. "There's no guy." Grace did not push the way Sophie sometimes did. She simply shrugged and said, "Okay. Well, whoever he is, he's lucky. You work harder for people than anyone I've ever met." The comment stayed with Amara longer than Grace probably intended. She thought about it on the walk home, turning the words over the same way she once turned over the memory of the rooftop, searching for meaning. She worked hard for people. She had always worked hard for Daniel, showing up whenever he needed her, remembering the small details of his life, celebrating his successes and softening his failures. She had given him 3 years of attention and patience and quiet devotion, and in return she had received friendship, closeness, warmth even, but never the one thing she actually wanted. She began to wonder, quietly, cautiously, whether hard work was even the right approach to love. Whether loving someone as much as she loved Daniel should have felt this heavy, this uncertain, this much like waiting for a door that might never open. She did not share these thoughts with Daniel. She continued to answer his calls, to listen to his stories, to show up when he needed her, because 3 years of habit does not unravel simply because a coworker makes an offhand comment during a late night at the office. But something had shifted, quietly, the way small shifts happen before anyone notices them. A seed planted in soil that has not yet shown any sign of growth on the surface. Winter arrived with its usual gray mornings and early sunsets, and Daniel's birthday fell on a Saturday in the middle of December. Amara had planned the entire evening herself, though she made sure it looked like it had come together naturally. A small dinner at his favorite restaurant with a handful of close friends, followed by drinks at the bar down the street where he had once told her he felt most like himself. She had spent weeks thinking about his gift, not because a gift needed to be complicated, but because she wanted him to understand, in some small way, how well she knew him, how much attention she paid to the details of his life that other people overlooked. She settled eventually on a set of vinyl records, 3 albums from a band he had mentioned loving as a teenager, but had never gotten around to owning on record, and a handwritten card that took her 4 attempts to get right, because every version she wrote said too much or too little, and she was terrified of landing anywhere except exactly in the middle. The dinner went well. Daniel was in good spirits, laughing easily, thanking everyone for coming, and when he opened Amara's gift last, after the others, his face changed in a way that made her chest tighten with something close to hope. "How did you even remember this?" he asked, turning one of the records over in his hands. "You mentioned it once. A long time ago." "That was years ago, Amara." "I know," she said, and something in her voice must have carried more weight than she intended, because he looked up at her then, really looked at her, the way he had on the rooftop that spring night, the way he rarely did. "You remember everything, don't you?" he said quietly, not quite a question. "Most things," she said, trying to keep her voice light. He did not say anything else, but he held her gaze a beat longer than usual before Grace, who had come along as Amara's +1, cleared her throat and asked what everyone wanted to order for dessert, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary noise of the table. Later that night, after most of the group had gone home and only Amara, Daniel, and 2 of his closer friends remained at the bar, Amara found herself standing outside for a moment of fresh air, the cold biting at her cheeks, the neon sign above the bar entrance flickering red and blue against the dark street. Daniel followed her out a few minutes later, his coat unzipped despite the cold, his cheeks flushed from the warmth inside and the drinks he had allowed himself on his birthday. "Thank you," he said, standing beside her. "Tonight, all of it, you didn't have to do all this." "I wanted to," Amara said honestly. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her in a way that felt different from how he usually looked at her, softer somehow, more present. "You always do more than anyone expects. I don't think I say that enough." "You don't have to say it at all." "I want to, though." He paused, and for a moment Amara thought he might say something else, something that would finally give shape to the feeling that had lived unspoken between them for so long. Instead he reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a small gesture almost automatic, and said, "You're a good friend, Amara. One of the best I've ever had." The word friend landed like a small stone dropped into still water, sending quiet ripples through her chest that she worked hard not to let show on her face. "You too," she said and smiled, because smiling was easier than saying anything true. They went back inside a few minutes later, and the rest of the night passed easily, filled with laughter and old stories and the particular kind of closeness that comes from years of shared history. But walking home that night, alone again, because Daniel had offered to walk her and she had told him again that she wanted the air, Amara found herself thinking not about hope this time, but about the word he had used. Friend. She had heard it from him many times before, and she would likely hear it many times again. And for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to wonder, quietly, cautiously, painfully, whether that word was not a stepping stone toward something more, but the entire destination itself, one he had already arrived at long ago while she remained standing somewhere further down the road, waiting for him to catch up to a place he had no intention of reaching. It was a small thought, easy to push aside in the daylight, easy to bury beneath the comfort of routine and the warmth of his attention. But it had been spoken now, even if only inside her own mind, and thoughts once spoken have a way of refusing to stay silent again, resurfacing quietly in moments she least expected, like a stone thrown into water that never quite settles back to stillness. The new year began quietly, the way years often do after the noise of December fades into ordinary routine. Amara made no resolutions that January, or rather, she made one, silently, without telling anyone, not even Sophie. She decided she would try, in whatever small ways she could manage, to build a life that did not revolve entirely around a phone that might or might not light up with a familiar name. It was harder than she expected. The pattern with Daniel had become so deeply worn into the shape of her days that stepping outside of it felt like trying to walk without a limb she had relied on for years. He still called late at night. He still texted her good morning, though sometimes now it came closer to noon, a small detail she noticed, and immediately scolded herself for noticing. He still came to her first whenever something in his life went wrong, and something in his life went wrong often, because Daniel seemed to move through relationships the way other people moved through seasons, expecting each new one to feel different while somehow arriving at the same familiar ending every time. In February, he began seeing a woman named Priya, someone he had met through his gym, and this one lasted longer than most, stretching through the cold months and into the beginning of spring. Amara met her once, at a casual dinner Daniel arranged with his usual mix of friends, and she found herself watching the two of them together with an attention that felt almost clinical, as though she were studying them for information she desperately needed, but did not want to admit she was looking for. Priya was kind. She asked Amara thoughtful questions about her work, complimented her earrings, laughed at her jokes in a way that felt genuine rather than polite. Amara liked her, in the uncomplicated way she might have liked anyone under different circumstances, and hating that she could not simply enjoy liking her without the quiet ache underneath. "She seems really good for him," Grace said afterward, when Amara relayed the evening during one of their now regular after-work drinks. "She is," Amara admitted. "She's patient with him. She doesn't let him get away with the moody stuff the way I do." "You let him get away with a lot," Grace said carefully, testing the words before committing to them fully. Amara stirred her drink, watching the ice shift and settle. "I don't let him get away with anything, I just understand him." "Is there a difference?" The question sat between them, uncomfortable in its simplicity. Amara did not answer right away, because the honest answer required admitting something she was not yet ready to admit out loud, even to a friend as direct as Grace. "I don't know," she finally said, "maybe not." Grace reached across the table and squeezed her hand, a small gesture that carried more warmth than the words that followed it. "I'm not trying to pile on. I just worry about you sometimes. You give so much of yourself to people who don't always notice." "He notices," Amara said, more defensively than she intended. "Does he though, really?" Amara thought about the birthday, the record, the moment outside the bar when he had tucked her hair behind her ear and called her one of the best friends he'd ever had. She thought about the rooftop, the pause before he laughed and blamed the wine. She thought about 11 weeks with Olivia, and now months with Priya, each relationship a small reminder that whatever Daniel was looking for, he had not yet found it in her, despite 3 years of searching for it right beside him. He notices some things, she said quietly, just maybe not the right ones. Priya and Daniel ended in April, not dramatically, but the way some things simply run out of momentum, fading until one day there is nothing left to sustain them. Daniel told Amara about it over coffee on a gray Sunday morning, sitting across from her at a small table by the window, rain streaking the glass beside them. She said I wasn't really present, he said, turning his cup slowly on its saucer. That even when we were together, it felt like part of me was somewhere else. Amara wrapped her hands around her own cup, letting the warmth seep into her palms. Do you think that's true? He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the rain. Maybe, I don't know, I've never really thought about where the rest of me goes. Amara wanted, desperately, to ask him the question that had been building in her for months now. The one that pressed against the back of her teeth every time he described another ending. Another woman who had loved him and left disappointed. She wanted to ask him if the reason he could never fully arrive in his relationships was because some part of him already knew, somewhere beneath the surface, that the person he trusted most, the person who understood him best, was sitting across the table from him right now, and had been for 3 years, and he had simply never allowed himself to look directly at that fact. She did not ask. Instead, she reached over and covered his hand with hers, the way she always did, offering comfort instead of confrontation, warmth instead of truth. You'll figure it out, she said. You always do eventually. I hope so, he said, and turned his hand over so their palms met, lacing his fingers loosely through hers for a moment before letting go to pick his cup back up. That small gesture stayed with Amara for days afterward, replaying itself in quiet moments, in the space between tasks at work, in the minutes before sleep took her under. She knew, somewhere in the more rational part of her mind, that gestures like this meant less to Daniel than they meant to her. That for him, holding her hand for a moment in a coffee shop, was simply an extension of comfort between close friends, nothing more complicated than that. But her heart, stubborn and hopeful in the way hearts often are when they have been waiting a long time for something, refused to accept the smaller, simpler explanation. It was Sophie who finally said the thing that Amara had been avoiding for 3 years, on a warm evening in late May. The two of them sitting on the small balcony of Amara's apartment, with glasses of wine sweating in the humid air. I need to say something, and I need you to actually hear it this time, Sophie said, setting her glass down with a deliberate care that told Amara this was not going to be a casual conversation. Okay, Amara said, bracing herself. You've loved this man for 3 years. 3 years, Amara. In that time he has dated at least 4 different women that I know of, probably more that I don't. Every single time one of those relationships ends, he comes back to you, and you take care of him, and you comfort him, and then he goes right back out and does it again with someone new. And through all of it, you've never once told him how you actually feel. I know all of this, Sophie. I don't think you do, not really. I don't think you let yourself sit with how much this is costing you. You've reorganized your entire life around being available to him. You've turned down other people who were interested in you because you were not really looking right now. You've spent 3 birthdays, 3 New Year's Eves, 3 summers, hoping that this would be the year he finally saw you. And he hasn't. And I love you, and it breaks my heart to watch this happen to you over and over again. Amara felt her throat tighten, tears rising unexpectedly, the kind that come not from a single sharp pain but from the slow accumulation of many small ones, finally reaching the point of overflow. What do you want me to do? I want you to ask yourself honestly whether staying quiet is protecting you or whether it's just protecting the fantasy. Because right now, as long as you never say anything, you get to keep believing that maybe, someday, things will change. But Amara, look at the pattern. 3 years of evidence is telling you something. I think you already know what it's telling you. I just don't think you've let yourself hear it yet. The words landed hard, harder than anything Sophie had said before, because this time there was no room left to deflect them into something smaller. Amara sat with the weight of them for a long moment, staring out at the darkening sky, the city lights beginning to flicker on below them. I'm scared, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. If I say something and he says no, I lose him, not just the possibility of something more. I lose the friendship too. I lose all of it. Maybe, Sophie said gently. Or maybe you'll finally get an honest answer, one way or another, and you can stop living in this in-between place that's slowly wearing you down. Either he feels something too, and you finally get to find out what happens next, or he doesn't, and you get to grieve it properly and actually start to heal, instead of hurting a little bit every single day in a way that never quite goes away, because it's never allowed to fully begin or fully end. Amara did not respond right away. She thought about the rooftop, the birthday, the coffee shop, all the small moments that had kept her hoping for 3 years, moments that felt significant in isolation but, laid out together in a long, uninterrupted line, told a much quieter and more painful story than the one she had been telling herself. I don't know if I'm ready to hear the answer, she admitted. I know, Sophie said, reaching over to take her hand, but you deserve to know it anyway. Whatever it is. That night after Sophie left, Amara sat alone on her balcony long after the wine had gone warm and the sky had turned fully dark. Her phone buzzed once, a message from Daniel, something about a show he wanted to watch together sometime that week, casual and warm and entirely unaware of the conversation that had just taken place, unaware of the 3 years of quiet devotion that sat behind every one of Amara's replies, every late-night phone call, every carefully chosen gift. She looked at the message for a long time before responding, her thumb hovering over the screen. She did not tell him that night. She was not ready, not yet, not with Sophie's words still settling heavy in her chest, not with the fear of losing him still louder in her mind than the exhaustion of loving him quietly. But something had shifted, the way the seed planted months earlier during that late-night conversation with Grace had finally begun slowly to push its first fragile shoot up through the soil. She typed back a simple reply, agreeing to the show, keeping things exactly as they had always been. But underneath the familiar rhythm of their friendship, something new had begun to stir, small and uncertain, but undeniably present. A question she could no longer fully silence, even if she was not yet brave enough to ask it out loud. How much longer could she keep doing this before the cost became too heavy to carry? She did not have an answer that night. But for the first time in 3 years, she had allowed herself to properly ask the question, and questions, once truly asked, rarely allow themselves to be forgotten again. Summer arrived early that year, the heat settling over the city by the first week of June, thick and heavy in a way that made even simple errands feel exhausting. Amara threw herself into work, taking on an extra project at the design studio, telling herself it was for the experience, though part of her knew it was also a way to keep her mind occupied, to leave less room for the questions Sophie had planted in her that had refused to fully quiet down since. Daniel, meanwhile, had not started seeing anyone new since Priya. This was unusual for him, a break in the pattern that Amara noticed immediately but tried not to read too much into. He seemed different that summer in small ways, quieter sometimes, more thoughtful, spending more evenings with Amara and their small circle of friends than he had in the past, when his time had often been divided between them and whoever he was dating. I think I need a break from all that, he told her one evening in June, the two of them sitting on a bench near the river, watching the last of the sunset bleed orange and pink across the water. Dating, I mean. I keep doing the same thing over and over and it never works out, and I'm starting to think maybe the problem isn't the people I'm choosing. Maybe it's something in me. Amara turned to look at him, surprised by the honesty in his voice, a rawness that felt different from his usual easy charm. What do you think the problem is? He was quiet for a while, watching a small boat move slowly across the darkening water. I don't know exactly. I think maybe I've been looking for something I don't actually understand yet. Like I keep expecting to feel a certain way, and when I don't feel it right away, I assume it's not there and I move on. But maybe that's not how it actually works. Maybe some things take longer to see clearly. Amara's heart began to beat a little faster, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. That sounds like it could be true. Yeah, he said, and then he looked at her, really looked at her, the way he had at the birthday dinner, the way he had on the rooftop that spring night a year earlier. You know, you're the one constant in all of this. Through every single one of those relationships, every ending, every mess, you've been right here. I don't think I fully appreciated that until recently. I've always been here, she said softly, her voice barely steady. I know, and I think that's part of why none of the others ever really worked. Because I kept comparing them to something, and I didn't even realize what that something was until pretty recently. The air between them felt charged, the way it had that night on the rooftop, full of something that had not yet been named but was pressing hard against the edges of language, seeking a way out. Amara held her breath, waiting, hoping, 3 years of waiting condensed into this single suspended moment beside the river. Amara, Daniel said, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant, an unfamiliar tone for a man who was usually so easy with words. Can I ask you something, and you have to promise to tell me the truth? Anything, she said. He looked down at his hands for a moment, then back up at her. Do you think two people can be perfect for each other as friends and still not work as anything more? Like, is it possible that the closeness itself is the whole thing, and trying to make it into something else would actually ruin it? The question landed like a stone dropped from a great height, all the momentum of the moment before crashing suddenly into something far heavier and more complicated than Amara had let herself imagine. She felt something inside her chest fold quietly in on itself, though she kept her face composed, years of practice allowing her to hide the reaction that wanted so badly to show. I think, she said carefully, choosing each word with the precision of someone walking across thin ice, that it depends on the people. Some friendships probably would be ruined, but I don't think that's true of every friendship. I've been thinking about this a lot, Daniel continued, seemingly unaware of the effect his words were having, or perhaps aware in some vague way, but unable to fully see the shape of what he was doing. I care about you so much, Amara, more than almost anyone in my life, and sometimes I wonder if there's something more there on my end, and then I get scared because what if I'm wrong and I ruin the best friendship I've ever had chasing something that isn't actually real? Amara sat very still, the river moving slowly beside them, the last light fading from the sky. This was the moment. This was the door she had glimpsed a year ago on the rooftop, standing open in front of her now more clearly than it ever had before. All she had to do was speak, to tell him the truth that had been living inside her for 3 years, to meet his uncertainty with her own certainty, and see what might grow from that honesty. Daniel, she said slowly, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it, I don't think you're wrong. He looked at her then, something shifting in his expression, surprise and something else, something that looked almost like relief. You don't. No, she said, and the words continued to come now, 3 years of held silence beginning finally to break loose. I've cared about you for a very long time, Daniel, longer than I think you realize. I've never said anything because I was scared of exactly what you just described, of losing this, of ruining what we already have by asking for something more. For a moment, neither of them said anything, the silence stretching between them, fragile and enormous. Daniel reached over and took her hand, his fingers threading through hers, and for one brilliant, suspended second, Amara believed that everything was finally about to change, that 3 years of patient waiting were finally about to be rewarded, that the door she had glimpsed so many times before was finally, truly, about to open all the way. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket, and the moment fractured. He glanced down automatically, an old habit, and Amara watched his expression shift as he read whatever appeared on the screen. Sorry, he said, letting go of her hand to check it. It's my sister. She's having some kind of emergency with her car. It's okay, Amara said, though something inside her had gone very still and very cold, the warmth of the moment before draining away with a speed that felt almost cruel. Daniel typed a quick reply, then looked back up at her, and something in his face had changed, some door that had been open a moment ago now quietly beginning to close. I should probably call her back. Sorry, this is not exactly how I wanted this conversation to go. It's fine, Amara said, though it was not. though the interruption felt like the universe itself intervening at the worst possible moment, snatching away the one chance she had waited 3 years for. They stood up from the bench, and Daniel called his sister as they walked back toward the street, and by the time the call ended, the mood between them had shifted entirely, replaced by the ordinary logistics of finding a taxi and saying good night. He hugged her before she got into the car, holding on a beat longer than usual, and said, "We should finish that conversation sometime soon." "Sure," Amara said, forcing a smile. But sometime soon did not come the way she had hoped. Over the following days, Daniel grew busier, distracted by his sister's car trouble, which turned into a larger family situation requiring his attention, and then a stressful stretch at work that ate up most of his evenings. The conversation by the river was never mentioned again, not directly, though Amara found herself waiting for it, hoping each time they spoke that he would bring it back up, that the door would swing open again the way it had for that one brief, brilliant moment. It never did. 2 weeks later, Daniel mentioned, almost in passing, that he had matched with someone on a dating app his coworker had convinced him to try. Someone named Fiona who worked as a nurse and had, according to Daniel, an incredible sense of humor. Amara listened to him talk about their first date with the same careful attention she always gave him, nodding at the right moments, asking the right questions, while something inside her quietly, finally, began to crack. She did not say anything that night. She smiled and wished him luck and told him she hoped it went well, and later, alone in her apartment, she sat on the edge of her bed and cried in a way she had not allowed herself to cry in a very long time, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet and steady tears that came from somewhere deep and tired, a place that had been carrying too much weight for too long. She thought about the river, about his hand in hers, about the question that had almost led somewhere different. She thought about Sophie's warning, about the pattern that kept repeating itself no matter how close they came to breaking it. And for the first time, she allowed herself to fully understand what Sophie had been trying to tell her for months. This was never going to be enough, waiting for a door that opened only partway before closing again. She had given Daniel 3 years of patient hope, and in return she had received closeness, warmth, moments that felt like almost, but never the thing itself, never the choice that would have required him to actually walk through the door rather than simply glancing at it before turning back toward whatever felt safer and more familiar. Something had to change. She did not yet know what or how, but sitting there in the quiet of her apartment, tears finally slowing, Amara understood, with a clarity that felt both terrifying and strangely calm, that she could not continue living inside this same pattern for a 4th year. Whatever came next, she would have to be the one to change it, because Daniel, it seemed, no matter how close he came to the edge of something real, would never be the one to take the final step across. The decision did not arrive all at once, the way decisions rarely do in real life despite how cleanly they are often described afterward. It arrived slowly, in small moments scattered across the weeks that followed, each one adding a little more weight to a scale that had been tilted in Daniel's favor for 3 years. The first small moment came on a Tuesday evening, when Daniel texted asking if she wanted to hear about his date with Fiona, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Amara did not answer right away. She sat with her phone in her hand, staring at the message, and instead of typing the immediate warm reply she always gave, she set the phone down and made herself dinner, ate slowly, washed the dishes, and only picked the phone back up 2 hours later. "I'm actually pretty tired tonight," she wrote. "Tell me about it another time." His reply came quickly. "Of course, no worries, feel better." It was such a small thing, delaying a single reply by 2 hours, but it felt, to Amara, like stepping off a path she had walked so many times that her feet knew every stone and root without needing to look. The path had felt safe because it was familiar, not because it had ever actually led anywhere good. Grace noticed the shift before anyone else, perhaps because she saw Amara most days, sitting across from her at the studio, watching the small changes that accumulated over the following weeks. "You seem different lately," Grace said one afternoon, the two of them taking a break on the small balcony outside the studio kitchen, coffee cups warming their hands despite the summer heat. Different how? Calmer maybe, or maybe just quieter. You used to check your phone constantly. I haven't seen you do that in a while. Amara considered the observation, turning her cup slowly. I've been trying to give myself some space, from checking it so much, I mean, from him mostly. Grace's eyebrows rose slightly, though she kept her tone light, careful not to push too hard. How's that going? Harder than I expected, Amara admitted. But maybe a little easier than I thought it would be, too. Some days I forget to check for a few hours, and it doesn't feel like the world is ending. That's good, that's really good, Amara. It doesn't feel good most of the time. It feels like I'm choosing to be lonelier on purpose. Grace reached over and squeezed her hand briefly. Sometimes the version of lonely that's honest is better than the version of not lonely that's built on hoping for something that isn't coming. I know that's not a comforting thing to hear, but I think it's true. Amara did not respond right away, watching the traffic move slowly on the street below the balcony. She thought about Fiona, about the way Daniel had described their second date the week before, the easy warmth in his voice, a warmth that had once been reserved almost entirely for conversations with her. She thought about how, for 3 years, she had positioned herself as the safe harbor he returned to after every storm, and how safe harbors, no matter how comfortable, are rarely mistaken for destinations. I think I need to stop being so available, she said finally. Not to punish him, just because I don't think I can keep doing this to myself. That sounds like a good place to start, Grace said gently. Over the following month, Amara began making small, deliberate choices that felt at first almost unbearably difficult, and then slowly a little less so. When Daniel called late at night, she let some calls go to voicemail, telling herself and eventually believing that whatever he needed to say could wait until morning. When he invited her to last-minute plans, she began checking her own calendar first, sometimes declining not because she had anything more important to do, but simply because she wanted to prove to herself that she could. She started saying yes to other things instead. Grace invited her to a pottery class that met on Wednesday evenings, and Amara found herself surprised by how much she enjoyed the quiet, focused rhythm of shaping clay with her hands, the particular satisfaction of watching something take form under her attention that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs or expectations. She reconnected with an old college friend named Noah, who had recently moved back to the city after several years away, and their easy, uncomplicated friendship reminded her of what it felt like to spend time with someone, without the constant undercurrent of hope and disappointment running beneath every conversation. You seem happy, Noah told her one evening, the two of them sharing a bottle of wine on his new apartment's small balcony, city lights spreading out below them. I'm trying to be, Amara said honestly. It's a work in progress. Well, whatever you're doing, it looks good on you. She laughed, and the laugh felt easy, unforced, different from the careful, managed warmth she had grown so used to performing for Daniel. Noah did not know the full story, though she had told him a simplified version one evening, enough for him to understand without her having to relive every painful detail. He had listened without judgment, offered no advice she had not already given herself 100 times over, and simply said at the end, "It sounds like you're allowed to want more than what you've been getting." The words had stayed with her, quiet and steady, in a way that felt different from the urgency of Sophie's warnings or the directness of Grace's observations. It sounds like you're allowed to want more. Daniel noticed the change gradually, the way people often notice the absence of something only after it has been gone long enough to leave a visible gap. His texts began asking, more frequently, whether everything was okay, whether she was upset with him about something. Everything's fine, she would reply, just busy lately. It was not entirely a lie. She was busy, filling her evenings with pottery classes and dinners with Noah, and long phone calls with Sophie that no longer centered exclusively around Daniel. But busy was also, she knew, a convenient word to hide behind, easier than explaining the truth, which was that she had finally begun to understand what it might feel like to build a life that did not orbit so completely around a single unmoving star. In early August, Daniel called her on a Friday evening, his voice carrying a note of urgency she had not heard from him in a while. "Hey, are you free tonight? I really need to talk to someone." Amara was getting ready for dinner with Noah, standing in front of her mirror, earrings half in. A year earlier she would have canceled instantly, without a second thought, rearranging her entire evening around whatever crisis Daniel needed to process. This time she paused, earrings still in her hand, and felt the old pull tug at her, familiar and strong. "What's going on?" she asked. "Fiona and I broke up. It's a whole thing. I just really need to talk it through with someone who gets it." The old version of Amara would have already been reaching for her coat. This version stood still for a long moment, feeling the pull, and for the first time in 3 years, choosing not to follow it entirely. "I'm really sorry to hear that," she said, and meant it, because despite everything she did not wish him pain. "I actually have plans tonight already. Can we talk tomorrow?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough that Amara wondered if the call had dropped. "Oh, yeah, of course, tomorrow's fine. I hope you're okay tonight," she added, softening the edges of her refusal, because kindness did not require self-erasure, a lesson she was still, slowly learning to hold on to. "Yeah, I'll be okay. Have a good night." She hung up the phone and stood in front of her mirror for a long moment, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with excitement and everything to do with the strange, uncomfortable bravery of choosing herself over the familiar pull of his need. It did not feel triumphant. It felt, if anything, a little sad, a small grief for the version of herself who would have dropped everything without hesitation, who would have believed wholeheartedly that this was what love required. Dinner with Noah was lovely that evening, easy and warm, and Amara found herself present in a way she had not always managed to be over the past 3 years. Her attention fully in the room rather than half-tethered to a phone that might, at any moment, demand her immediate return to old patterns. Daniel called the next day, as promised, and Amara did meet him for coffee, listening as he processed the end of his relationship with Fiona, offering comfort in the way she always had. But something in the exchange felt different now, more balanced somehow, as though she were no longer pouring herself entirely empty in order to fill him back up. "You seem different lately," he said, echoing Grace's words from weeks earlier, though his tone carried something more uncertain, almost wary. "Different how?" Amara asked, curious what he had noticed. "I don't know. A little more distant, maybe. You used to always be available. Now sometimes it takes you a while to text back, or you're busy when I need to talk." "I don't know. I guess I got used to you always being there." Amara considered her words carefully before responding, choosing honesty over the reflexive reassurance she might have offered a year earlier. "I've been trying to take better care of myself, Daniel. I think I spent a long time putting everyone else's needs ahead of my own, including yours, and I'm trying to find a better balance now." He looked at her for a moment, something unreadable passing across his face. "That makes sense. I'm sorry if I ever made you feel like you had to do that." "You didn't make me do anything," she said, because it was true, and because she had come to understand over the past weeks of quiet reflection that the pattern she had built had been shaped as much by her own choices as by his. "I chose to give as much as I did. I'm just choosing something different now." He nodded slowly, though she could tell the shift unsettled him in some way he had not yet fully articulated, even to himself. For 3 years, Amara's constant availability had been a steady, reliable presence in his life, something he had likely never examined too closely, simply trusting that it would always be there whenever he needed it. Now, for the first time, he was beginning to feel the edges of what her absence might actually mean, though the full weight of it had not yet arrived. That fall, Amara continued building the shape of a life that felt increasingly her own. She finished a set of ceramic bowls in her pottery class that she was genuinely proud of, uneven and imperfect in the way that handmade things often are, but hers, entirely hers, made with hands that had spent so long shaping themselves around someone else's needs. She took a weekend trip with Sophie to visit a coastal town neither of them had been to before, walking along windswept beaches and eating fresh seafood at small restaurants, laughing in a way that felt uncomplicated and light. Her friendship with Noah deepened slowly, without pressure, without the anxious hoping that had characterized so much of her relationship with Daniel. She found herself, more than once, comparing the ease of that connection to the exhausting vigilance she had maintained for years around Daniel, always watching for small signs of change, always hoping, always managing her own feelings so carefully that she sometimes forgot to simply enjoy the moment she was in. Daniel, meanwhile, seemed increasingly unmoored without the steady presence he had grown so used to. He did not date anyone new that fall, a break from his usual pattern that stretched longer than any before it. He called Amara less frequently, perhaps sensing on some level that the old rhythm no longer fit the way it once had. But when he did call, there was a different quality to his voice, something searching, something that had not been there before. "Do you ever think about how things used to be?" he asked her one evening in late October, the two of them sharing a quiet dinner at a small restaurant they used to frequent often, but had not visited together in months. "Sometimes," Amara admitted. "I miss it, not that things are bad now. I just miss how easy it used to be, how close we were." Amara looked at him across the table, this man she had loved quietly for 3 years, watching his face carefully in the dim restaurant light. "We're still close, Daniel." "It feels different, though." "It is different," she said gently. "I'm different. I had to be for my own sake." He nodded, though the uncertainty in his expression did not fully clear, and Amara understood, watching him, that whatever he was beginning to feel, whatever gap her quiet withdrawal had opened up in his life, he had not yet found the words to name it, let alone the courage to address it directly. But something had shifted between them, undeniably, a change in the current of their long friendship that neither of them could fully ignore any longer, even if neither of them yet understood exactly where that shifting current might eventually lead. Winter settled over the city again, marking the start of what would become the 4th year since that first dinner, where Amara had watched Daniel tell his road trip story across a table of mismatched chairs. She did not think about the anniversary the way she once might have, counting the months and weeks with the careful attention of someone measuring out hope in small doses. This year felt different, quieter, the counting having lost its urgent grip on her. Daniel's life, meanwhile, had begun to feel increasingly unsteady, though he could not always identify why. His work had grown more demanding, a new manager bringing changes that left him stressed and uncertain about his position. He had not dated anyone seriously since Fiona, and though he told himself this was simply a natural pause, a break he needed after a long stretch of relationships that never quite worked, there was a loneliness creeping into his evenings that he had not experienced in years, not since long before he had first met Amara. He noticed it most acutely on the nights he used to call her without thinking, the reflexive reach for his phone interrupted now by a hesitation that had not existed before. Sometimes he still called, and she still answered, still listened, still offered the same warmth she always had. But there was a boundary there now, subtle but unmistakable, a sense that she was present with him, but no longer fully available to him in the way she once had been, no longer arranging her entire evening around whatever he needed. He found himself, more than once, staring at his phone late at night, thumb hovering over her name, and then setting it down instead, some new awareness stopping him from reaching out the way he used to, a quiet understanding that the old rhythm no longer applied, even though he could not fully articulate why it bothered him so much. In January, the situation at his job came to a head. The new manager, dissatisfied with a project Daniel had led, criticized his work harshly in front of the rest of the team, and though Daniel handled the meeting with outward composure, the humiliation sat heavy in his chest for the rest of the day. His first instinct, walking out of the office that evening into the cold, was to call Amara. She would understand. She always understood. She would listen to him rehash every detail of the meeting, would tell him he was talented and undervalued, would make him feel, by the end of the call, that the world had not actually ended. He dialed her number, standing on the cold sidewalk outside his office building, watching his breath fog in the winter air. The call went to voicemail. He tried again 20 minutes later, from his apartment, sitting on the edge of his couch with his coat still on. And again the call rang through to voicemail, her recorded voice cheerfully informing him that she could not come to the phone right now. He sent a text instead, "Rough day, call when you can." The reply came almost an hour later. "Sorry, was at pottery class, phone was in my bag. What happened, are you okay?" He explained the situation in a series of messages, and she responded with sympathy, with kind words. But the immediacy he had grown so used to, the sense that she was always instantly available whenever he needed her, was simply not there in the same way it once had been. She had been somewhere else, doing something that had nothing to do with him, entirely unaware for over an hour that he needed her. The realization sat strangely in his chest, an unfamiliar discomfort he could not quite name. For 3 years, Amara's attention had felt like a constant, something he had never had to consider or protect because it had simply always been there, reliable as sunrise. Now, for the first time, he was confronting the reality that her attention was not, in fact, a permanent fixture of his life, but something she gave by choice, something that could be, and apparently now was being, directed elsewhere. He tried calling Sophie that night instead, someone he had known for years through Amara but had never developed much of an independent friendship with, and the conversation felt stilted, unfamiliar, Sophie offering polite sympathy but nothing close to the deep, easy understanding he had always found with Amara. He tried talking to a coworker over drinks, and while the coworker was sympathetic, there was no real depth to the exchange, nothing that touched the particular ache sitting in his chest. By the time he went to bed that night, Daniel found himself thinking, for the first time in a long while, about just how singular Amara's presence in his life had actually been. Not simply a friend among many, but something closer to an anchor, the one person who had always, without fail, made him feel understood in a way no one else quite managed. And he had, somehow, without ever fully realizing it, allowed himself to take that anchor entirely for granted, assuming it would always hold steady no matter how little attention he paid to maintaining it. The following weeks brought more of the same quiet unease. He would think to call Amara about something, a small victory at work, a funny thing that happened on his commute, and increasingly he found that by the time he reached for his phone, some new hesitation stopped him, an awareness that she might be busy, that she might not answer right away, that the old certainty had eroded into something far less stable. He mentioned it, eventually, to his sister, during one of their regular phone calls, the same sister whose car trouble had interrupted the pivotal conversation by the river all those months earlier. "I feel like something's changed with Amara," he said, staring out his apartment window at the gray winter sky. "She used to always be there. Now it feels like she's pulled back, and I don't really understand why." His sister was quiet for a moment before responding, her voice careful. "Daniel, has it ever occurred to you that Amara might have feelings for you, like real feelings beyond friendship?" The question landed with unexpected force. "I mean, we talked about something like that once, by the river actually a while back. But then things got complicated, and it never really came up again." "And you never followed up on that conversation?" He thought back, uncomfortable with how easily he could recall the details of that evening and how completely he had failed to return to them afterward. "I guess not. Things got busy, and then I started seeing Fiona not long after, so." "Daniel," his sister's voice carried a weight of exasperation that felt, somehow, entirely deserved. "Do you understand what that must have looked like from her side? She opens up to you about something that's significant, and then within weeks you're dating someone else." He had not thought about it that way before, or rather, he had thought about it only in terms of his own confusion and uncertainty in that moment, never fully considering how his subsequent actions might have appeared from Amara's perspective. The realization settled uncomfortably in his stomach. "I didn't mean for it to look like I was dismissing what she said." "Maybe not, but intentions and impact aren't always the same thing. If she really does care about you the way it sounds like she might, and you basically brushed past that conversation and moved on to someone else right after. I imagine that hurt her a lot more than you realize." Daniel sat with his sister's words long after the call ended, turning them over slowly, examining details he had never fully allowed himself to look at directly before. He thought about the birthday dinner, the record he had loved so much, the careful, thoughtful attention Amara had always paid to the smallest details of his life. He thought about the countless late nights she had listened to him talk through his problems, never once asking for anything in return except, apparently, the one thing he had never given her, which was simply the chance to be seen and chosen the way she had always seen and chosen him. He thought, too, about how easily he had let the conversation by the river slip away, distracted first by his sister's car trouble, and then by the ordinary momentum of his life, never circling back to finish what had felt in the moment like the beginning of something significant. He had told himself, in the weeks that followed, that perhaps it had not meant as much as it felt like in the moment, that perhaps he had imagined the intensity of it. Now, sitting in his apartment months later, he understood that he had not imagined anything. He had simply been too comfortable, too certain of Amara's continued presence in his life, to feel any urgency about following through. He decided that evening that he needed to see her, to actually talk to her, properly this time, without distractions, without the safety of assuming there would always be another chance later. He called her the next day and asked if she would meet him for dinner, somewhere quiet, just the two of them. She agreed, though something in her voice sounded careful, guarded in a way that had become increasingly familiar over the past months but still struck him with a small pang of loss for how open and unguarded she used to be with him. The days leading up to the dinner felt strange to Daniel, filled with a nervous anticipation he was not used to feeling around Amara. Normally, their time together felt effortless, familiar, requiring no particular preparation. This time he found himself thinking carefully about what he wanted to say, rehearsing sentences in his head during his commute, discarding them as either too much or not enough. Aware, in a way he had never quite been before, that this conversation carried real weight, that what he said in the next few days might genuinely determine the shape of everything that came after. He thought, too, about the years that had passed, replaying moments he had barely registered as significant at the time, but that now, viewed through this new understanding, took on entirely different meaning. The jacket on the rooftop that he had offered without thinking, and the way she had held on to it, wrapped tightly around her shoulders, longer than the cold alone would have required. The careful, deliberate thought behind the birthday gift, records from a band he had mentioned loving only once, years earlier, remembered by someone who apparently paid far closer attention to him than he had ever paid to her in return. The countless nights she had made herself available, without complaint, without ever asking him to reciprocate that same steady presence. 3 years, he thought, sitting alone in his apartment the night before their dinner. 3 years of someone loving him quietly, faithfully, patiently, while he moved from one relationship to another, always returning to her comfort without ever considering that the comfort itself came at a cost she was paying, silently, over and over again. He did not know, sitting there that night, whether it was too late to make things right, whether the quiet distance that had grown between them over recent months represented a door already closed, or one that might still, if he approached it carefully and honestly, be persuaded to open once more. He only knew that he could no longer continue pretending he had not noticed what was happening, could no longer allow himself the comfortable ignorance that had let him take her presence for granted for so long. For the first time in 3 years, Daniel found himself lying awake, not thinking about a relationship that had recently ended, not processing some fresh disappointment from a woman he barely remembered a month later. He was thinking about Amara, really thinking about her, about who she was beyond the role she had so quietly and consistently played in his life, and about what it might mean at this late stage to finally, truly see her. The restaurant Daniel chose was small and quiet, tucked down a side street away from the busier parts of the city, the kind of place with soft lighting and enough space between tables that conversations could unfold without being overheard. He arrived early, which was unusual for him, and sat nervously turning his water glass in slow circles while he waited. Amara arrived a few minutes later, wearing a coat Daniel did not recognize. Her hair pulled back in a way that felt slightly different from how she used to wear it, small details that reminded him, uncomfortably, of just how much time had passed since he had last paid this close attention to her. "Hi," she said, sliding into the seat across from him, her tone warm but measured, the easy openness of years past replaced by something more careful. "Thanks for coming," Daniel said. "I know I've been kind of vague about why I wanted to talk." "You have," she said, a small smile softening the words. "But I figured you'd get to it eventually." They made brief small talk about their weeks, the ordinary rhythms of catching up that had once felt so effortless between them and now carried a faint undercurrent of tension neither of them fully addressed. Daniel found himself watching her more closely than usual, noticing things he had perhaps always known, but never truly examined. The way she tilted her head slightly when she was really listening, the small laugh lines at the corners of her eyes that had deepened slightly over the years he had known her, the quiet confidence in the way she now carried herself, different from the eager, endlessly accommodating warmth he had grown so used to. When the food arrived and the initial small talk had settled, Daniel took a breath and finally began the conversation he had spent days rehearsing. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he said, "about us. About our friendship and what it's meant to me over the years." Amara set down her fork, giving him her full attention, though her expression remained carefully neutral, guarded in a way that made Daniel's chest tighten with the recognition of what he might have lost through his own inattention. "I talked to my sister a few weeks ago," he continued, "about how I've been feeling kind of unmoored lately, like something's shifted between us, and I couldn't quite figure out what. And she said something that made me think about a lot of things differently." "What did she say?" "She asked if you might have feelings for me, real feelings beyond friendship. And she reminded me about that conversation we had by the river a long time ago now. And she pointed out that right after that, I started seeing Fiona, and how that must have looked from your side." Amara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze steady but unreadable. "That's a lot to think about all at once." "I know, and I guess what I'm trying to say is, I've spent the last few weeks really looking back at everything at the last 3 years, and I think I finally understand something I should have understood a long time ago." He paused, gathering his courage, aware that whatever he said next would matter more than almost anything he had ever said to her before. "I think I've loved you for a long time too, Amara. I just didn't let myself see it clearly because you were always there, always so steady and reliable, and I think I mistook that steadiness for something ordinary, something I didn't have to actively choose or work for, when really it was the rarest thing anyone had ever given me." The words hung in the air between them, 3 years of unspoken feeling finally given voice, though the timing, Amara could not help but notice, had arrived only after her own feelings had begun, slowly and painfully, to change shape. "Daniel," she said softly, "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything right now," he said quickly, some of his earlier composure cracking under the weight of hope and fear tangled together. "I just needed you to know. I should have said something a long time ago, back by the river, instead of letting my sister's phone call interrupt everything and then never bringing it back up. I let myself get distracted, and then I let months go by without ever circling back to something that clearly mattered so much to both of us. I'm sorry for that. I really am." Amara looked down at the table for a moment, gathering her thoughts, feeling the weight of 3 years pressing against this single conversation. A conversation she had once imagined so many times, rehearsed in her mind during countless sleepless nights, hoping desperately for exactly these words to eventually arrive. "I did love you," she said finally, and Daniel's face shifted at the past tense, something like alarm flickering across his features. "For a long time, Daniel, longer than you probably ever realized. I used to lie awake wondering if you'd ever see me the way I saw you. I used to hope, every single time something ended for you, that maybe this would be the time you'd finally look at me differently." And now, he asked quietly. Amara took a slow breath, choosing her words with the same careful precision she had once used to hide her feelings, though now she used it to finally reveal them honestly. Now, I've spent the last several months learning how to build a life that doesn't revolve so completely around waiting for someone else to choose me. And it wasn't easy. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But somewhere in that process, I think I started to become a different version of myself. A version who isn't quite as available as she used to be, not because I'm punishing you, but because I finally understood that I deserve someone who chooses me clearly and quickly, and doesn't need 3 years and a conversation with his sister to finally see what was right in front of him. Daniel's expression fell, the hope that had carried him into this dinner slowly giving way to something more complicated, a mixture of understanding and regret settling over his features. "I understand," he said quietly. "I really do. I know I don't have any right to expect you to just be there, waiting after everything." "It's not about rights," Amara said gently, softening slightly at the genuine pain in his voice, because despite everything, she did still care about him, would likely always care about him in some form. "It's about what I've learned about myself over the last year. I spent 3 years making myself endlessly available to you, hoping that patience alone would eventually be enough. And it taught me something important, which is that love that requires you to shrink yourself down, to make yourself small and constantly available and endlessly patient, isn't actually the kind of love that leads anywhere good, no matter how much you want it to." "So there's no chance," Daniel said, more statement than question, though something in his voice still held onto a thread of hope. Amara considered the question honestly, searching within herself for the truest answer she could offer. "I don't know," she said finally. "I'm not saying no, not completely, but I'm not the same person who would have said yes without hesitation a year ago either. If there's something here worth building, it's going to have to be built differently than the way things were before. Slowly. Honestly. With both of us actually choosing it, out loud, instead of one of us just hoping quietly while the other one figures things out on his own timeline." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of what she was telling him, understanding, finally, the full cost of the years he had spent comfortably unaware, never noticing how much he had been given until the giving itself had begun, quietly and deliberately, to change. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course." "What changed? I mean, I know you said you've been working on yourself, building a different kind of life, but was there a specific moment? Something that made you decide to stop waiting?" Amara thought back over the past year, the conversation with Sophie on her balcony, Grace's quiet observations at the studio, the slow accumulation of small choices that had eventually added up to something bigger than any single moment could account for. "I think it was a lot of small things," she said. "Friends telling me the truth even when I didn't want to hear it. Realizing how much of my own life I had put on hold, waiting for you to catch up to something I'd already decided a long time ago. And eventually just getting tired, in a good way, of hoping for something I couldn't control, and deciding to focus instead on things I could." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a new kind of humility, different from the easy confidence she had grown so used to over the years. "I want to be honest with you. I don't know exactly what this looks like from here. But I know I don't want to just let you walk away without at least trying to understand what it would mean to actually choose you, properly, the way you deserved from the beginning." Amara looked at him for a long moment, this man she had loved quietly for 3 years, now finally saying the words she had once longed so desperately to hear, though the timing, she understood now, was never going to erase the years of patient waiting that had come before it. Whatever came next between them, it would have to be something entirely new, built on honesty rather than hope, on mutual choice rather than one-sided patience. "I'm willing to see where this goes," she said carefully, "but slowly, Daniel, and honestly. I'm not the same person who used to reorganize her whole life around your phone calls. I don't think I ever want to be that person again, no matter what happens between us." "I understand," he said, and for the first time in the entire conversation, something in his expression looked genuinely humbled rather than simply hopeful, an understanding settling over him of just how much he had nearly lost, and how much work remained ahead if he truly wanted to become someone worthy of what she had offered him so quietly for so long. They finished dinner slowly, the conversation between them lighter than it had been in months, though carrying a new kind of honesty that neither of them had allowed themselves before. Walking out of the restaurant into the cold evening air, Daniel offered to share a car home, and this time, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, Amara said yes. The weeks that followed the dinner unfolded slowly, carefully, in a way that felt entirely unfamiliar to both of them after 3 years of a friendship built on easy, unquestioned closeness. Daniel called less often now, but when he did call, there was an intention behind it that had not always been there before, a sense that he was reaching out because he genuinely wanted to hear her voice, not simply because he needed somewhere to unload whatever difficulty his day had brought him. Amara noticed the difference immediately, though she remained cautious, unwilling to let herself slip back too quickly into old patterns. When he asked her to dinner a second time, a week after their conversation at the small restaurant, she agreed, but she made sure the plans fit around her pottery class rather than replacing it, a small boundary that felt to her enormously significant. "You could come with me sometime," she offered, almost as a test, curious how he would respond to being invited into her life rather than simply inviting her into his. "I'd like that," Daniel said, and the following Wednesday he showed up at the small studio where her class met, sitting quietly in the corner, watching her work the clay with a focus and skill he had never had the opportunity to witness before. Afterward, walking home together through the cool evening air, he told her with genuine wonder in his voice, "I had no idea you could do that. You never really talked about it much." "I didn't think you'd be that interested," she admitted. "I want to be interested," he said, "in all of it. I think I spent a long time only seeing the parts of you that were directed at me, and never really asking about the rest." It was a small conversation, but it marked something important, a shift in the shape of their relationship that continued to unfold over the following months. Daniel began asking about her work at the design studio with genuine curiosity, remembering details from one conversation to the next, following up on projects she mentioned weeks earlier. He met Noah for the first time at a group dinner, and rather than feeling threatened by the easy friendship Amara had built during their months apart, seemed genuinely glad that she had people in her life who cared about her beyond their own connection. There were difficult moments too, inevitable given the weight of history between them. One evening in March, Daniel mentioned offhandedly that an old friend of his had asked if he was seeing anyone, and he had hesitated, unsure how to describe what was happening between him and Amara, since neither of them had used any particular label for it yet. "I didn't really know what to say," he admitted later that night, sitting across from her at her kitchen table. "I don't want to assume anything, but I also don't want to keep dancing around what this actually is." Amara considered the question carefully. "What do you want it to be?" "I want to be with you," he said, more directly than he had allowed himself to speak in any of their previous conversations. "Not just as friends who are figuring something out. I want this to be real, Amara. I know I don't have the right to rush you after everything, but I also don't want to keep pretending I don't know what I want." "I want that too," Amara said softly, and something in her chest, some long-held tension she had not fully realized she was still carrying, finally began to loosen. "But I need you to understand something. I need this to keep being different from how things used to be. I can't go back to being the person who drops everything the moment you call. I need us to actually build something together, evenly, both of us choosing it every day, not just me hoping and you eventually catching up." "I understand," Daniel said, reaching across the table to take her hand, the same gesture he had offered so many times before over the years, though this time it carried a different weight, a clearer intention behind it. "I want to build it that way too. I've had a lot of time to think about the kind of partner I want to be, and it's not the version of myself who took your patience for granted for 3 years. I want to be someone who actually shows up, consistently, the way you always showed up for me." They became, officially, a couple that spring, though the transition felt less like a single dramatic turning point and more like the natural culmination of months of careful, honest rebuilding. Sophie, meeting Daniel for coffee not long after, watched the two of them together with an attentiveness that Amara recognized immediately. "He seems different," Sophie said afterward when it was just the two of them again. "More present somehow, like he's actually paying attention to you instead of just talking at you." "He's trying," Amara said. "I think he really is trying." "And how are you feeling about all of it?" Amara thought about the question seriously before answering, aware that Sophie deserved an honest response after years of gently, and sometimes not so gently, trying to help her see clearly. "Cautiously hopeful, I think. I'm not the same person I was 3 years ago, waiting by my phone, rearranging my whole life around his schedule. I don't think I could go back to being that person even if I wanted to. But this feels different. It feels like something we're actually building together, instead of something I'm just hoping will eventually happen." "That's all I ever wanted for you," Sophie said, squeezing her hand. "Not necessarily him specifically. Just someone who sees you as clearly as you deserve to be seen, and chooses you the way you've always chosen everyone else." The following months brought their own challenges, as any real relationship does. There were moments when Daniel fell back into old habits, forgetting to check in during a stressful week, and Amara found herself having to gently, but firmly, remind him of the boundaries they had agreed to build together. There were moments when Amara, in turn, had to work against her own old instincts, resisting the urge to simply absorb his stress silently rather than voicing her own needs clearly. But each difficulty became an opportunity for the kind of honest conversation that had been almost entirely absent from the earlier years of their friendship. Conversations where both of them actually said what they meant, rather than one of them quietly hoping the other would somehow intuit it. By early summer, nearly a full year after that pivotal, interrupted conversation by the river, Daniel planned a small gathering to celebrate what would have been, in some sense, the 4th anniversary of the night they first met, back at that same small restaurant with mismatched chairs, though the restaurant itself had since closed and been replaced by something new. Instead, he arranged a dinner at a different, quieter place, inviting only their closest friends, Sophie and Grace and Noah among them. Near the end of the evening, after most of the toasts and the easy laughter of old friends catching up, Daniel stood and raised his glass, his expression carrying a seriousness that quieted the table. "I want to say something," he began, looking directly at Amara. "4 years ago, I sat at a dinner table and told a story about a road trip, and I had no idea that the woman sitting across from me would end up becoming the most important person in my life. It took me far too long to understand that. I spent years taking her patience for granted, assuming she would always be there no matter how little effort I put into actually seeing her clearly. I don't say that with pride. I say it because I think it's important for everyone here, and especially for Amara, to know that I understand exactly how much I almost lost, and how much I don't take for granted anymore." He turned more fully toward her, his voice softening. "You taught me what it actually means to be loved patiently, and then you taught me, maybe even more importantly, what it means to demand something better than patience alone. I'm grateful for both lessons, even though I know the second one cost you more than I probably realize. I don't know exactly what the future holds, but I know I want to keep choosing you, every day, the way you deserve to be chosen from the very beginning." The table erupted into quiet, warm applause, and Amara felt tears rise, not the heavy, exhausted tears of years spent waiting, but something lighter, a release of a burden she had carried for so long she had almost forgotten what it felt like to set it down. Later that night, walking home together through streets that felt both familiar and entirely new, Daniel took her hand, and Amara let him, feeling none of the old anxious hope that used to accompany even the smallest gestures of affection, only a quiet, steady certainty that had taken years, and a great deal of difficult, honest work to finally arrive at. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been," Daniel asked, "if I had just said something sooner, by the river that night before my sister called?" Amara considered the question, looking up at the familiar city skyline stretched out above them. I used to think about it a lot, but I think, honestly, we needed those extra months. I needed them, at least. I needed to learn who I was outside of waiting for you. And maybe you needed them too, to actually understand what you almost lost, instead of just assuming I'd always be there. That's a generous way to look at it. Maybe, but I think it's also true. Some things can't be rushed into being right. They have to actually be built slowly by two people who are both paying attention. She squeezed his hand gently. We're paying attention now. That's what matters. They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, the kind that comes only from years of genuine familiarity, finally matched by equal effort on both sides. And when they reached her apartment building, Daniel did not simply say good night and leave the way he once might have, assuming her time and attention would always be available whenever he next needed them. Instead, he asked softly if he could come up, and Amara, standing there in the warm summer evening with the man she had loved patiently for 3 years and honestly for 1, said yes, not out of old habit or quiet hope, but because it was, finally, exactly what she wanted, chosen clearly by both of them at last. 2 years passed, and the city around them changed in the way cities always do. New buildings rising where old ones had been torn down, familiar coffee shops closing and being replaced by others, the particular rhythm of years accumulating without anyone quite noticing until they looked back and realized how much ground had been covered. Amara and Daniel moved in together during the second spring after that dinner at the small restaurant, choosing an apartment with a wide window that caught the morning light, a detail Amara had insisted on after years of waking up in rooms that faced only brick walls and narrow alleys. Their life together settled into a rhythm that felt, to both of them, remarkably different from the years that had come before it. Daniel still worked in marketing, though he had moved to a new company by then, one with a healthier culture and a manager who actually valued his contributions. Amara had left the design studio to start a small business of her own, selling handmade ceramics through a shop she ran partly online and partly out of a small studio space she shared with Grace, who had left the design world around the same time to pursue her own creative work. The pottery, which had once been a small act of quiet rebellion, a way of building a life outside the boundaries of waiting for Daniel, had grown into something Amara genuinely loved, a craft she had developed real skill in over the years. And Daniel often stopped by her studio in the evenings, not because she needed him to, but because he wanted to, sitting quietly in the corner with a book or his laptop while she worked, present in the way he had learned to be present without demanding attention, simply choosing to share space with her because he valued her company for its own sake. Not every day was easy. There were still moments when old patterns threatened to resurface, evenings when Daniel came home stressed from work, and Amara caught herself slipping automatically into the role of endless, absorbing comfort before catching herself and instead asking him, gently, to actually talk through what he needed rather than simply performing the emotional labor of fixing it for him. There were moments when Daniel, in turn, had to consciously resist the old instinct to assume Amara's patience was infinite, to remember that love, the kind worth building a life around, required continuous effort rather than the comfortable assumption of permanence. Sophie now married herself to a quiet, thoughtful man named Liam she had met the year after Amara and Daniel finally found their footing, remained one of Amara's closest confidants, the two of them meeting regularly for the same kind of honest, sometimes difficult conversations that had once helped Amara see clearly what she needed to change in her own life. "Do you ever worry?" Sophie asked one afternoon, the two of them sitting in Amara's studio while she glazed a set of bowls destined for a local market, "that you'll slip back into old habits, into just giving and giving without asking for anything in return?" Amara considered the question carefully, turning a bowl slowly in her hands. "Sometimes, I think that instinct probably never fully goes away. But I've gotten better at noticing it when it starts happening, and at actually saying something instead of just absorbing it quietly. That's the real difference, I think. It's not that the old instinct disappeared completely. It's that I've finally learned to catch it before it takes over everything." "And Daniel, does he notice when you're slipping into that pattern?" He does, actually. It surprised me at first how much he pays attention now. He'll ask me sometimes if I'm doing okay, if I need something, in a way he never used to before. I think losing me, even just for those months when I pulled back, taught him something he couldn't have learned any other way. Grace, working at the table nearby, glanced up from the mug she was shaping. I still think about that conversation we had at the office all those years ago, when I asked who the guy was and you tried to pretend there wasn't one. Amara laughed, the memory carrying none of the old ache it once might have. I remember, you saw right through me. I think everyone around you did, eventually, except him, Grace said. That's usually how it goes, though. The person waiting can see everything clearly, and the person they're waiting for is somehow the last one to notice. He noticed eventually, Amara said. That's what matters, I think. Not that it took him a long time, but that, when he finally did notice, he actually did something about it, instead of just letting the realization pass by unexamined. That autumn, nearly 3 years after the interrupted conversation by the river that had marked the beginning of everything shifting between them, Daniel proposed, not with elaborate spectacle, but quietly, on an ordinary evening, in the studio where Amara spent so much of her time, surrounded by shelves of her own careful, imperfect work. I know this isn't the most dramatic setting, he said, kneeling among the scattered tools and half-finished pieces, his voice unsteady with a nervousness that felt, to Amara, deeply familiar and deeply moving, the same vulnerable honesty he had first shown her at that small restaurant years earlier. But I wanted to ask you here, in the place where you built something entirely your own, because I think that's what I love most about you. Not just how you love other people, though you do that better than anyone I've ever known, but how you learned, eventually, to build a life for yourself too, one that doesn't depend on anyone else choosing you in order for it to be worthwhile. I want to spend the rest of my life choosing you, every single day, the way you deserve. Will you marry me? Amara said yes, tears rising, not from the aching, uncertain hope of years past, but from a fullness that felt entirely different, earned rather than merely wished for, built through years of honest, difficult, deliberate work rather than simply hoped into existence through patience alone. They married the following summer, in a small ceremony held in a garden not far from the studio, surrounded by the friends who had walked alongside Amara through every difficult year of waiting and every subsequent year of rebuilding. Sophie stood beside her, as she always had. Grace and Noah were there too, along with Daniel's sister, who had unknowingly set everything into motion with a single honest question during a phone call years earlier. During his vows, Daniel spoke about the years he had spent not seeing clearly, and the harder years afterward spent learning how to see properly, how to love in a way that required active, continuous choice, rather than passive, comfortable assumption. Amara, in turn, spoke about learning that love should never require a person to disappear into someone else's needs, that the healthiest kind of love left room for both people to remain fully, separately themselves, even while building something entirely new together. Looking out at the small gathering of people who had supported her through years of quiet hope and difficult growth, Amara felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and completely at peace. Not because everything had turned out exactly the way she once imagined it might, back on that rooftop years ago, watching the city stretch out below them like a field of fallen stars, but because it had turned out to be something better than that early. Uncertain hope could have ever fully predicted. A love built not on patient waiting, but on mutual, deliberate choice. A partnership shaped not by one person's endless giving, but by two people who had both learned, in their own time and their own difficult ways, exactly what it meant to truly see and be seen. As the evening light softened over the garden, Daniel took her hand, the same gesture he had offered so many times over the years, though now it carried none of the old uncertainty, none of the quiet ache that had once accompanied even his smallest attentions. It simply meant what it had always meant to say, spoken clearly now, finally, by both of them together. I choose you, today and every day after this one.